Every morning, she smiled before leaving for work. The kind of smile you trust without thinking twice. I built my days around that smile, my family, my patience, my silence. Until one ordinary morning, a small detail didn't line up, and I followed it instead of looking away. What I found wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calculated, familiar, and cruel in a quiet way. If you've ever stayed silent too long, you might recognize what came next. Mornings at our place outside Atlanta followed a rhythm I could walk through half asleep. Coffee first, then lunch bags, then the quiet knock on my son's bedroom door. Shoes by the entrance, keys always in the same bowl. Nothing special. That was the point. After years of work and long commutes, ordinary had started to feel like a reward. My wife moved through those mornings with ease. Hair tied back, jacket already on, phone in her hand. She smiled every time she stepped out, a soft habit more than a gesture. I used to think that smile meant peace. Maybe I needed it to mean that. The drive to school was short. My son talked about a quiz he hadn't studied enough for. I told him he'd be fine, the same way I always did. At the drop-off line, he waved and disappeared into the building without looking back. Kids learn independence faster than adults admit. Back home, the kitchen clock ticked louder than it should have. My wife stood near the counter, scrolling through her phone. The screen went dark the moment I walked closer. She slid it into her bag with a quick motion, too practiced to be accidental. I didn't say anything. Bills sat neatly stacked by the fridge. Utilities, insurance, a few envelopes I didn't recognize. Over the past few months, numbers had stopped lining up the way they used to. Small amounts at first, charges that didn't belong to any store I knew. When I asked, she brushed them off. Just work stuff. I'll explain later. Later never came. That morning, she mentioned the loan again. Said it casually, like asking me to grab milk on the way home. It'll make things easier. Just temporary. The paperwork waited in her bag, already filled out except for my name. I scanned the first page, noticed the interest rate, the timeline. My credit carried the weight. Hers stayed untouched. Silence settled between us. Not tense, familiar. I signed. She thanked me with that same smile, kissed my cheek, and headed for the door. I followed her outside without thinking, watched as she walked toward the car. The engine started. She checked her mirrors, phone already back in her hand, then waved once before pulling out. I stood there longer than necessary, keys still in my pocket. At Walmart, I wandered the aisles without a list, picked up things we didn't need, left half of them at the register. The parking lot buzzed with late morning traffic, families loading groceries, workers on break, a woman arguing into her headset, life going on without coordination. Her car rolled in 10 minutes later. It parked 2 rows away. I watched from behind my windshield. She didn't notice me, didn't look around. Another car pulled up beside hers, newer, darker. A man stepped out. They talked briefly. No touching, no rush, just familiarity. He leaned closer than necessary when he laughed. She didn't smile the way she did at home. This one stayed longer. They drove off together, her car following his. Hands tightened around the steering wheel. The engine hummed, waiting. I pulled out of the space without checking my mirrors, kept enough distance to look casual. Traffic swallowed us near the exit. Red light, green. The gap widened, then closed again. Thoughts came slow, unhelpful. Work schedule, errands, coincidences. The road curved toward Buckhead instead of downtown. At the next intersection, I hesitated. A choice small enough to pretend it didn't matter. The light turned green. My foot stayed heavy on the pedal as the distance between us shrank again, then stretched, then disappeared behind a line of trucks. I parked near the edge of the lot, cut the engine, and sat there with the windows up. The clock on the dashboard blinked, waiting to be reset. People passed by, carts rattling, conversations half finished. From where I sat, her car was already gone. I stayed a few minutes longer, watching the entrance as if she might come back, as if that would explain everything. Then I stepped out, locked the door, and walked toward the store without knowing what I planned to buy. My phone started buzzing before noon. Not calls, messages, short ones, missed ones, names I hadn't heard from in months suddenly checking in, asking how things were going, whether everything was okay at home. Nobody asked directly. They never do. Questions arrived wrapped in concern, padded with small talk. At work, conversations slowed when I walked into a room. Meetings ended a little faster. A supervisor asked if I needed time off, said it casually, like a favor. I told him no and went back to my desk. Numbers on the screen blurred for a moment before settling back into place. By the end of the day, I knew something had shifted. Dinner that night was quiet. My wife talked more than usual, filling space. Stories about coworkers I'd never met, complaints about stress, about being misunderstood. She mentioned her mother, her sister, how worried they were about her lately. They think I'm carrying everything alone. The words landed carefully, arranged to make silence look like guilt. I washed the dishes while she scrolled through her phone at the table. A notification popped up. She turned the screen away, then looked up at me like she'd been waiting for a reaction. Nothing came. The next morning, my sister called, asked if everything was all right between me and my wife, said she'd heard things sounded tense. I told her we were fine. That answer didn't satisfy her, but it ended the conversation. At lunch, a coworker mentioned seeing my wife with someone at a restaurant near Buckhead. Laughed it off, said it was probably nothing. The tone suggested otherwise. Rumors move faster than facts. They don't need truth to travel, just repetition. I started noticing who stopped speaking to me altogether. Invitations disappeared. A group chat went quiet the moment I replied. At church, people nodded without stopping. Concern had turned into distance. At home, tension found new shapes. Requests became demands. Conversations circled the same points until I stopped responding. Each pause was treated like confirmation. You never say anything, that's the problem. I thought about all the years I'd done exactly that. Held things together by refusing to pull on loose threads. Kept peace by absorbing pressure. That strategy had worked until it didn't. Midweek, I took a longer lunch and drove into Midtown. The cafe sat on a corner I used to pass every day before changing routes. Old habit brought me there. I ordered coffee I didn't need and sat near the window. Marcus arrived late, like always. We'd worked together years back, before promotions pulled us into different buildings. He listened more than he spoke. Still did. He didn't ask what happened, just waited. I told him pieces, not everything, enough to make sense of my face. He stirred his drink, nodded once. Silence works when people respect it, he said. When they don't, it turns into permission. That was all. No advice, no judgment, no sympathy wrapped in noise. Just a statement that didn't ask me to agree. Outside, traffic moved in uneven bursts. People crossed the street mid-conversation, lives intersecting without noticing. I finished my coffee and checked the time. Missed 2 calls, one from my wife, one from her mother. Marcus stood first. Whatever you do it on purpose. He left before I could respond. Back in the car, I sat with the engine off. Thought about the way stories had started forming without me. How absence invites invention. How easily a role gets assigned when you don't claim one. The phone buzzed again. I let it ring, then silenced it. Pulled out of the spot and merged into traffic, heading back toward the office instead of home, hands steady on the wheel, while the rest of the day kept moving forward. Her schedule stopped making sense once I stopped accepting it at face value. On Tuesday, she said she had an early meeting downtown. On Wednesday, the same meeting ran late. By Friday, the hours shifted again, explained away with a shrug and a comment about how chaotic work had become. I nodded, like I always had, but something in me started counting instead of listening. A receipt slipped out of her bag that night when she set it on the counter. Buckhead, a restaurant I'd never heard her mention. I picked it up without thinking, scanned the date, the time. Lunch hour. She told me she'd skipped lunch that day. When I asked, the answer came fast. Client meeting. I forgot to tell you. The words fit. Too easily. Doubt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through small openings. A calendar entry that disappeared. A charge moved from one account to another. A conversation that ended the moment I entered the room. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they refused to stay quiet. One afternoon, a man stopped me outside the office building. Said he thought he recognized me. We talked for less than a minute. He mentioned seeing my wife often, usually around the same time each week, always with someone else. His tone wasn't accusing, just casual, like sharing weather updates. I laughed it off, thanked him, Walked away with my head full of static. Maybe I was tired. Maybe stress was filling in gaps that weren't there. That explanation felt safer. I tried to hold on to it. At home, access narrowed. Shared accounts required confirmation. Documents I used to reach sat locked behind passwords I didn't recognize. Her parents started calling more, asking about finances, offering to help manage things so she wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Help has a way of arriving once control is already gone. I began to keep copies. Nothing dramatic. Screenshots, statements, dates written down in the Notes app on my phone. The kind of habits you build when you stop trusting memory alone. I memorized patterns instead of confronting them. Phone calls shortened. Messages stayed unanswered longer. I stopped explaining myself, stopped correcting assumptions. Silence, again, felt easier than arguments I wasn't ready to finish. One evening, her sister dropped by unannounced, sat at the table and spoke like I wasn't there. "She's under a lot of pressure," she said. "You know how she is." I knew how she wanted to be seen. The conversation ended without resolution. Dishes piled up. The TV played something nobody watched. I took out the trash and stood outside longer than necessary, breathing in air that didn't carry expectations. Inside, my wife closed the bedroom door before I reached it. Sleep came in pieces that night. By the weekend, the house felt different. Not hostile, managed. Like a place rearranged while you're still living in it. I noticed which rooms she avoided when I was home, which calls she took outside, how often my name came up in conversations that stopped when I entered. I cut back on my own noise, skipped gatherings, declined invitations, left work early once and didn't say where I was going, drove aimlessly for half an hour before parking near a public library and sitting there, phone face down, thinking about how quickly routines turn into assumptions. The man's comment replayed itself when I tried to focus on anything else. So did the receipt, the shifting hours, the sudden concern from people who'd never asked before. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even clarity, just pressure, building slowly, pushing against a structure I'd trusted for years. That night, I opened a folder on my laptop and labeled it with the date, dropped in the files I'd collected so far, closed it without looking through everything. From the hallway, I heard her laughing on the phone, a low sound, relaxed, unfamiliar. I stood there for a moment, then walked into the kitchen and started making coffee, even though it was already late. She chose a crowded place to say it. We were supposed to meet her parents and a few friends for lunch downtown. Nothing formal, just one of those gatherings meant to show everything was fine. I arrived a few minutes late, slid into the chair beside her, and caught the shift in her posture before she spoke. "I can't keep doing this alone." The table went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Someone asked what she meant, and she didn't hesitate. "He controls everything. The money, the decisions. I don't even feel like myself anymore." Eyes turned toward me. Not hostile, curious. That was worse. I didn't raise my voice, didn't interrupt, waited until the silence circled back. "We've made decisions together," I said. "That's all." The answer didn't defend me. It wasn't meant to. It only set a boundary. She shook her head, let out a small laugh that sounded practiced. "See? He always minimizes it." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her father avoided my eyes. Someone mentioned stress. Another person nodded like the explanation fit. Lunch continued without me. Conversation shifted around my presence, not including it. I finished my drink, stood, and said I had to get back to work. No one stopped me. By the time I reached the office, the damage had already spread. An email waited from HR asking me to stop by. Nothing urgent, they said. Just a quick conversation. The phrasing was careful, neutral. Inside the small room, two people sat across from me. They asked if everything was okay at home, if anything was affecting my performance. I answered directly, no, no, no. They thanked me and reminded me of company policies, about conflicts and disclosures. I nodded, took the pamphlet they slid across the table, and left without reading it. Later that afternoon, a notification hit my phone. A withdrawal, not small, from an account my name had been removed from that morning. I called. It went to voicemail. Another alert followed. A transfer, legal, authorized. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen until the numbers stopped moving. At home, the house felt rearranged again. A folder on the counter labeled with her name. Documents inside. Bank statements. A note explaining that she needed independence, that this was temporary, that everything would be clearer soon. "I had to protect myself," she said from the doorway. "You don't leave me a choice." I read the pages slowly. Each one carried my signature from years ago. Permissions I'd granted without imagining they'd be used like this. Strategy dressed up as necessity. That night, messages started arriving. People asking what was going on. Others offering advice I hadn't requested. A few stayed silent, which said more than the rest. At work the next day, my supervisor reassigned one of my projects, framed it as support, less pressure, a favor. I thanked him. Downtown Atlanta moved the same way it always had when I left the building that evening. Traffic stacked and released. Sirens passed without concern. I walked to my car and sat there longer than usual, hands resting on the wheel, phone face down on the seat beside me. The urge to confront her rose and passed. So did the need to explain myself to people who had already decided what fit best. Instead, I started the engine, pulled into traffic, and drove past the exit that led home, heading toward the part of the city where the streets stayed busy and nobody asked questions. The email came from an address I didn't recognize. No greeting, no explanation, just a sentence and an attachment. "You should look at this before you decide to keep waiting." I opened it at my desk, then closed my office door. The file held a timeline, dates, locations, transactions, laid out without commentary. Buckhead showed up more than once. So did a name I'd only half known, someone I remembered from years back, tied loosely to a project that had gone sideways and quietly disappeared. Memory filled in what I'd avoided thinking about, a conversation from long ago, a warning brushed aside because it didn't fit the life I was building then, back when believing in people felt safer than verifying them. The pattern was clearer now that I wasn't trying to blur it. I didn't reply. Saved the file to the folder on my laptop and shut it down. That night, I drove past the house and kept going until the streets thinned out. Parked near a strip mall and sat there with the engine off, hands resting on my thighs, breathing steady. Marcus answered on the second ring. "You sound like someone who finally stopped hoping things would fix themselves." He didn't ask how I got his number again. Gave me a name instead, a family lawyer he trusted. Straightforward, not cheap. Honest in ways people don't always appreciate. The office sat in a low building near Decatur. No dramatic signs. Just a door with frosted glass and a waiting room that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The lawyer listened without interrupting, took notes, asked questions that didn't lean one way or the other. "You have options," he said when I finished. "None of them are painless. All of them require you to decide what you're willing to lose." I appreciated that he didn't pretend there was a clean outcome, only legal ones. At home, the pressure changed shape. My wife started speaking carefully around others, choosing words that made her sound patient and me distant. Calls from her parents increased. They asked about the kids, about money, about whether I planned to cooperate. "We just want what's best for everyone." That phrase did a lot of work for them. One evening, my son asked why I wasn't around as much. Said his mom told him I needed space. The explanation landed heavier than anything she'd said to me directly. I kept my voice even. Sometimes adults have to handle things quietly. He nodded, accepted it the way kids do when answers are incomplete but confident. Messages circulated online. Vague posts about strength, about choosing yourself, about surviving control. People reacted with sympathy. Some reached out to me privately, apologetic, curious. I didn't correct them. Safety lived in that silence. So did erasure. The lawyer called 2 days later, told me what filing would mean, what evidence mattered, what timing could change. He didn't rush me. After the call, I stood in the kitchen and watched the clock tick toward dinner. The house sounded normal, too normal for what was happening beneath it. I thought about how long I'd measured my worth by how much I could absorb, how often restraint had been mistaken for weakness, even by me. The choice wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with certainty or relief, just a clear line between staying comfortable and staying intact. I opened my laptop, logged into the folder, and began organizing the files the way I organized everything else in my life. Dates first, then amounts, then names. From the living room, her voice drifted through the hallway, calm, convincing, mid-conversation with someone who believed her. I kept working, fingers steady on the keyboard, arranging the pieces in an order that finally made sense. Workdays started blending together, not because nothing happened, but because everything did. I moved through routines with purpose again, logged hours, reviewed reports, answered questions without offering extra. The same approach carried over once I got home. Files stayed open late, statements printed and rechecked, numbers compared against dates until patterns stopped feeling accidental. The process felt familiar. This was how I'd handled problems long before marriage complicated them. Break things down, remove assumptions, let facts sit where emotions used to be. Accounts told stories people didn't. Money shifted predictably once you followed it long enough. Transfers coincided with the same days she claimed overtime. Withdrawals lined up with weekends she said she needed space. A few amounts repeated, precise enough to suggest planning rather than impulse. I built a timeline and stuck to it. No commentary, no guesses, just sequence. Sleep shortened but improved. The noise in my head quieted once I gave it something to focus on. Anger lost its edge. Sadness didn't disappear, but it stayed contained, like weather you prepare for instead of curse. Signs started appearing anyway. A message arrived late one night from an unknown number. "Why are you digging around?" No threat, no name, just awareness. I didn't respond. The next morning, a login alert popped up from a device I didn't recognize. Password changed, then changed again. I tightened access everywhere, layered security like muscle memory kicking in. At work, someone asked if I'd been requesting information from finance. I said yes, kept my tone even. The question lingered a second too long. Outside the office, a car slowed near the crosswalk before continuing on. Coincidence, probably. Still, I noted the plate number without meaning to. Home felt narrower. Doors closed more often. Conversations happened behind walls. My wife stopped asking where I was going. That alone said enough. One evening, my son mentioned a man he'd met. Said he'd shaken his hand, friendly, had a nice watch. The description matched nobody I knew. I asked when. Last weekend. I nodded, asked what they talked about. Sports, school, nothing alarming. Still, I made a note. The lawyer checked in midweek, asked if anything had changed. I told him progress was steady. He reminded me to avoid confrontation, said preparation loses its power once it turns reactive. I followed that advice carefully. At night, I organized documents the way other people unwind. Labels, folders, backups. The rhythm helped, gave shape to something that had tried to stay vague. Messages from family slowed, posts online shifted tone, sympathy thinned, curiosity replaced it. People sensed movement, even if they didn't know its direction. Another text arrived, this one longer. "You don't want to do this. Think about the kids." That one stung, not because it worked, but because it confirmed I wasn't imagining the pressure. Someone else had entered the conversation without stepping into the room. I deleted the message and kept working. Late Friday, I drove instead of going straight home. Parked near the courthouse, sat with the engine off, watching people head into the building for reasons of their own. No one looked relieved. No one looked surprised either. The idea that truth alone would fix things had already faded. Timing mattered. Presentation mattered. Control mattered more than volume. Back at the house, lights were on in rooms I wasn't welcome in anymore. Laughter floated down the hallway, careful and contained. I set my keys down quietly and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The folder had grown, not bloated, complete. I scrolled through the timeline once more, made a few adjustments, then saved everything to an external drive and slipped it into my bag. From the living room, a voice asked who I'd been talking to. "Just work," I said. The answer didn't invite more questions. I shut the laptop, stood, and started rinsing the coffee mug I hadn't finished earlier, already planning the next steps while the water ran. The letter arrived on a Thursday, mixed in with grocery ads and a utility bill. Custody mediation, temporary orders, dates highlighted in yellow like warnings. I read it once, then again, slower the second time. The language was polite and firm, the kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. Inside the house, nothing stopped moving. My son asked what was for dinner. The dog waited by the door. A pot boiled over because I forgot it was on. Life kept asking for attention while something heavier pressed from the edges. She didn't bring it up that night. Let the document do the talking. The next day, her parents showed up unannounced, sat in the living room like they owned the place, speaking in calm tones about stability and routine, about how children needed consistency, about how conflict could be damaging. "We just want to make sure he's protected," her mother said. "Protected from me," was the part left unsaid. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something older. A memory surfaced without invitation. Being young, watching my own parents split rooms like territory, promises made in low voices, broken quietly. I remembered how easy it was to feel like luggage passed between adults who meant well. That fear hit deeper than anything else so far. I kept my voice steady. "He's safe here." Her father nodded, as if acknowledging a technicality. "For now." The phrase stuck. At work, the shift became visible. Access to certain systems paused pending review. A meeting postponed without rescheduling. Someone from legal asked if I'd disclosed everything relevant to my personal situation. The implication didn't hide behind courtesy anymore. I answered what I could, avoided what I had to. By the end of the day, exhaustion sat heavy in my shoulders. Not the kind sleep fixes, the kind that comes from holding ground without moving. That night, she finally said it. "I'm filing for full custody." The statement landed clean, without emotion, a decision already rehearsed. "You're not present, you're distracted. This isn't healthy for him." I looked at her and saw how carefully she'd built this version of events. How many conversations had led here. How much silence she'd used as raw material. "You're doing this to punish me," I said. She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. "I'm doing what I have to." Messages followed after that, from friends, from family, some subtle, some direct. Questions about my temper, about whether I'd ever scared her, about why I wouldn't just cooperate and make things easier. Easier for who stayed unclear. Sleep thinned to fragments. I woke up before alarms, sat at the edge of the bed, listened to the house breathe around me. Every sound carried weight. Every decision felt irreversible. On Saturday, she took our son out early, said they'd be back by dinner. Didn't say where they were going. Hours passed. I checked my phone more than I meant to. No messages, no updates. Just silence stretched long enough to start shaping thoughts I didn't want. The lawyer returned my call late in the afternoon. Listened, asked questions, then paused. "They're trying to move you emotionally," he said. "Force a reaction. Don't give it to them." Easier advice to give than to follow. When they came back, my son ran past me into his room without stopping. She stayed by the door. "He's confused," she said. "You should give him space." I nodded, watched them disappear down the hall. The house felt hollowed out. Familiar walls, unfamiliar roles. I walked from room to room without purpose, touching things I'd bought, fixed, assembled over years. None of it felt like leverage now. A message came in from the same unknown number. "This ends badly if you keep pushing." I stared at the screen, then set the phone down, and stood there until the urge to throw it passed. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that losing quietly might be simpler. Letting the story settle without correction, paying whatever cost came with peace. That thought stayed longer than I liked. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, grounding myself in something basic. The folder sat in my bag by the door. Evidence, timelines, proof, all of it waiting. Silence had kept things calm before. It had also given her room to build this. I thought about my son again, about what he would learn from watching this unfold, about whether he'd grow up thinking endurance was the same as strength. The glass emptied without me noticing. I set it in the sink, wiped my hands on a towel, and reached for my bag. In the living room, the television played low, something harmless and forgettable. She laughed at it, relaxed, already living in the version of the future she'd planned. I stepped past without comment, walked down the hall, and closed the door behind me, pulling the folder out onto the desk as my phone buzzed again with another message I didn't read. The knock came just after lunch, firm but unhurried. I opened the door to a woman I didn't recognize at first. Late 40s, tired eyes, posture straight like someone used to standing her ground. She said my name once, then introduced herself without stepping inside. "I don't have much time. I thought you should hear this from me, not through lawyers." We sat at the kitchen table. She placed a folder between us, didn't open it right away. Her hands rested flat, steady. She worked at the restaurant in Buckhead. Not a manager, not a server, accounting. Part-time, quiet role, easy to overlook. She'd seen my wife there more than once, always during business hours, always with the same man. She hadn't thought much of it until money stopped lining up at work. I started checking timestamps, she said, then names. The folder slid toward me, copies of receipts, internal logs, a handwritten note explaining what didn't fit. Dates matched my records. Amounts mirrored the transfers I'd traced back home. I didn't interrupt. Let her speak until she ran out of things she felt safe saying. "I'm not doing this for you," she added. "I'm doing it because I don't want my name tied to something dirty." That made sense. After she left, the house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Not empty, settled. I laid everything out across the table, her documents next to mine, separate paths converging into the same shape. The man's name appeared again, this time tied to a shell company I'd flagged earlier, but hadn't fully understood. Personal and professional lines blurred in ways that courts tend to notice. Hope didn't rush in. Relief stayed distant. Caution took the lead. She came home early that evening, mood lighter than it had been in days. Talked about mediation, about compromise, about how hard everything was on her. "I don't want this to get ugly," she said. The word choice almost made me laugh. I listened, asked a few neutral questions, gave nothing away. She watched my face closely, searching for cracks, found none. Later, her parents called, tone soft, suggested reconciliation, mentioned how strong she'd been through all of this. Someone cried quietly on the line. I said I appreciated their concern and ended the call. Online, the narrative held steady. Posts about resilience, comments full of hearts and encouragement. The surface still belonged to her. Behind it, pressure built. The unknown number tried again. "You're being advised badly. This won't end how you think." I didn't delete it this time. Took a screenshot, dropped it into the folder. The lawyer reviewed everything the next morning, read slowly, asked pointed questions, nodded once when I finished. "This changes leverage," he said, "not outcome. Leverage." That distinction mattered. We discussed strategy, timing, what to file and when. He reminded me that restraint still mattered, even now, especially now. At home, she grew restless. Conversations sharpened. Accusations slipped through more often. She mentioned costs, delays, how drawn-out battles hurt children. "You're dragging this out," she said one night. "For what?" I didn't answer. The man showed up again, this time openly, parked across the street and waited in his car. No attempt to hide, no greeting either. A message delivered without words. I noted the time, the plate, took a photo. That was when the last piece clicked. He wasn't just support, he was exposure. The more visible he became, the less protected she was willing to be. Their interests weren't aligned anymore. Pressure would turn inward soon. I stopped wondering whether this would work, started focusing on execution. That night, I slept longer than I had in weeks, not peacefully, just deeply. In the morning, I packed my bag with copies I didn't plan to carry before, left the originals where they belonged, kissed my son on the head as he ate breakfast, told him I'd be back later. "Don't forget," he said, "you're picking me up today." I nodded, wrote it down anyway. At the door, she watched me with a look that mixed suspicion and confidence, still convinced the ground favored her. I stepped outside, locked the door, and walked to the car, already rehearsing the order of conversations that needed to happen before the day ended. The conference room felt smaller once everyone took their seats. Papers spread across the table, stacked neatly, labeled, ready. My lawyer nodded to me, a quiet signal that it was time to listen more than speak. Across from us, she sat upright, composed, hands folded like this was another meeting she planned to manage her way through. She started strong. "He's unpredictable," she said, withdrawn, emotionally unavailable. "I've carried the responsibility for years." Her voice held steady. She'd practiced this. Each sentence landed where she wanted it, shaping a picture that left little room for correction. Her attorney leaned into it. Questions about my schedule, my stress, whether I'd ever raised my voice, whether I'd ever scared her. I answered carefully, yes or no when possible. No explanations offered. When they brought up control, she leaned forward. "He monitors everything, money, time, even who I talk to." That one cut deeper than I expected. Not because it was true, but because it echoed something old. My parents' arguments, whispered behind doors, each accusing the other of the same thing. I felt the room tilt for a moment, memory crowding in where focus should have been. My lawyer cleared his throat. May we respond? He didn't rush, slid the first document across the table. A timeline, dates, transfers, patterns. Not dramatic, just orderly. She glanced down, then back up. That doesn't prove anything. Another page followed, then another. Each one answered a question she hadn't expected to be asked. Her attorney frowned, flipped through the copies, paused longer than before. We can explain that, she said quickly. Those were work-related. My lawyer nodded. That's interesting, because this next set comes from a third party. The name landed with weight. Her posture shifted, not much, enough. He continued, laying out the restaurant records, the internal logs, the shell company ties. Each connection traced calmly, without accusation, just placement. She shook her head, eyes bright now. This is harassment. He's been digging through my life. I felt the urge to speak rise and fall. Let it pass. The room quieted as the mediator stepped in, asking for clarification. My lawyer provided it, slowly, clearly. When the unknown number appeared in print, messages enlarged and time-stamped, her attorney stopped writing, looked up at her instead. Who is this? She didn't answer. At the courthouse later that day, the air shifted again. Formal, restrained. No room for narratives, only facts that held up when repeated. She tried one last turn. He's doing this to hurt me. The judge listened, expression unchanged. Asked questions that cut through framing and landed on logistics. Money trails, custody arrangements, intent. When it was my turn, I spoke once. I want stability for my son. That's it. Nothing more. The decision didn't come immediately. Temporary orders adjusted, access restored, custody shared, restrictions placed where they belonged. Not victory, balance. Outside, she stood near the steps, phone pressed to her ear. The man from Buckhead waited at the edge of the lot, arms crossed, impatience written across his stance. They didn't look at each other. My lawyer asked if I wanted to say anything. I shook my head. Not today. Walking to the car felt heavier than expected, not from loss, but from release. The fight had drained out of the space between us, leaving only consequences behind. At a stoplight, my phone buzzed, a message from her. You didn't have to do all this. I didn't reply. Traffic moved again. I followed it toward the school, checked the clock, adjusted my route to avoid construction. Ordinary decisions returned, one after another. In the pickup line, my son spotted me and waved. I waved back, stepped out of the car when it was my turn, signed the clipboard, and took his backpack from him without asking how his day went yet. He talked anyway, filling the space with details that mattered to him. I listened, started the engine, and merged back into the afternoon, already planning dinner while the courthouse were seated behind us. The house felt lighter once the papers were signed and filed. Not emptier, just less crowded with things that didn't belong to me anymore. Morning settled into a new pattern. Breakfast for two on certain days. One backpack by the door instead of 2 pairs of shoes scattered around. I stopped bracing myself before opening messages. Bills arrived on time and made sense again. Accounts stayed where they were supposed to be. What surprised me most wasn't relief. It was clarity. I started seeing my old habits for what they had been. Not patience, not strength. Avoidance dressed up as responsibility. I had confused endurance with virtue for a long time, told myself that absorbing discomfort kept families intact. All it really did was teach other people where my limits weren't. That realization stayed with me longer than any argument ever had. The consequences unfolded without drama. Her finances came under review once the court orders went through. The shell company didn't survive scrutiny. The man from Buckhead stopped appearing after his name surfaced in places it shouldn't have. Support faded quickly when explanations were required instead of sympathy. I didn't track the fallout closely. Didn't need to. Conversations with her became brief and functional. Drop-off times, school events, medical forms. Nothing personal slipped through. When she tried once, I redirected it without raising my voice. Let's keep this about him. She nodded, irritation flashing before control returned. That was fine. Boundaries don't require agreement. Work stabilized too. Projects returned. access restored. A quiet acknowledgement from management that personal matters were no longer a concern. No apologies. None were necessary. One afternoon, I left early and drove to Piedmont Park. No particular reason. The weather held steady, neither impressive nor dull. People moved through the space at their own pace, joggers, parents, couples walking without urgency. I sat on a bench with a coffee I hadn't finished and watched my son chase pigeons near the path. He laughed freely, unburdened by adult versions of events. That mattered more than any outcome in court. The urge to explain myself surfaced briefly, to justify choices, to frame the story one last time in my favor. It passed. Some truths don't need defending once they're placed correctly. A message came through while I sat there, from her, short. "I hope you're happy now." I read it once, then locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Happiness wasn't the word I would have chosen. Peace fit better. Control, too. Not over anyone else, just my own life. When it was time to leave, I stood, tossed the empty cup, and called my son over. He ran up, breathless, talking about something he'd noticed by the water. I listened, nodded, asked a question that kept him going. We walked toward the car together. No rush. No weight pulling us backward. Later that evening, dinner cooked while homework spread across the table. A routine rebuilt without noise. I checked the calendar, noted the next pickup, replied to a work email, and turned the stove down a notch before anything burned. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet. Lights came on in houses one by one. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and stopped. I rinsed the pan, dried my hands, and stood there for a moment, thinking about how silence used to scare me, how it felt like loss. Now it just felt honest. I turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall, and reminded my son it was almost time for bed, already planning tomorrow without needing to look back.